So welcome everyone to this instalment of the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion Humane Philosophy Project seminar series on naturalism. As I'm sure you're all aware, we're very honoured to have speaking today Professor Timothy Williamson. Professor Williamson has been the Wickham Professor of Logic here at the University of Oxford since the year 2000. He's published many leading works in the philosophy of language, philosophy of logic, metaphysics and epistemology. He's a Fellow of the British Academy of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He's a foreign member of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, also the Royal Irish Academy and Academia Europaea. His publications are far too many to list, but a small selection include Vagueness, published in 1994, a recent philosophical dialogue called Tetralogue, as well as the 2000 classic Knowledge and Its Limits. And today Professor Williamson is going to speak to us on the topic, what is naturalism? So please give him a very warm welcome.
Well, I'm going to talk about naturalism from the perspective of a philosopher. It's a word that one hears quite a lot in contemporary philosophy, and it's generally being used by people who self-identify as naturalists, and they use it to praise certain ways of doing things in philosophy or certain philosophical moves as naturalistic, and to condemn others as incompatible with naturalism. Now, I'm in the odd position of finding myself classified by some people as a naturalist and by others as an anti-naturalist. And I don't think that this is really because there's anything particularly obscure about the positions on the basis of which they're making these classifications. I think the reason is because the notion of naturalism itself is an obscure one. And it seems to me that it's obscure in ways which are damaging because they enable a certain kind of somewhat illegitimate exploitation of the notion of naturalism. So what I'll do is talk about different ways in which the term naturalism might be understood. I'm not going to attempt anything like a complete survey of all the senses in which the term does get used, but I think the ones I talk about will be in some way representative, and about the different implications of naturalism depending on how you understand it. I think there's a big divide between two types of understanding of it, which broadly speaking one might call metaphysical and methodological. So let me explain what I mean by that. So with a rough idea of a metaphysical sense of naturalism would be something like the view that there is only the natural world, whatever exactly that means. So that's a doctrine simply about what there is, if you like, about the nature of reality. Whereas you also get definitions of naturalism which, by contrast, are methodological in that they're not a characterization directly of the nature of reality, but of how we should try to understand the nature of reality. And typically they're of the form that the best or possibly the only way of understanding the world is by using scientific method, whatever exactly that is. Now, I'll say something about the sort of the more metaphysical understanding of naturalism, because in fact I think that under pressure that tends to collapse into the more methodological understanding of the term. So if you ask people what they mean by the natural world, then they're likely in philosophy to give you an answer that sort of gestures towards fundamental physics. I mean, so that they might say something like it's just atoms in the void, or they might say something more negative, like, well, there are no ghosts or souls, or something like that. But when you press, you find that self-identified naturalists will tend to go soft on that, because a typical worry about characterizations of that kind is that they might not actually fit contemporary science. So, I mean, you can, worry, for example, that if you look at general relativity or quantum field theory or something, that they just do not say that there's only atoms in the void. In fact, their understanding of the nature of physical reality is very different. And so that, as it were, the sort of more traditional characterizations in those kind of terms, they often seem to rely on something like 19th century physics. And and I think if you press this point on people who regard themselves as naturalists, typically they're going to be quite concessive, and they don't feel that it's their job to defend a specific physical theory of the world, and they'll be quite happy to substitute for atoms in the void or whatever it is, the idea that the natural world is simply the world that science is in the process of discovering, something like that. And so, in effect, they're falling back on a more methodological definition of naturalism, because what they're identifying as the natural world is not something by, as it were, some list of its ingredients, but simply by the method by which it's discovered and studied. And I think that also goes for even things, the more negative descriptions, like, well, I mean, there aren't any ghosts or souls or whatever, in the sense that if you say to a self-described naturalist, but just suppose that some kind of scientific investigation could provide evidence for the existence of ghosts or whatever it was, then would you still feel compelled by your naturalism to deny that there are ghosts? And I think the typical naturalist answer to that would be, no, of course not. If there was experimental evidence for the existence of ghosts, whatever that might consist in, then I'd be perfectly happy to acknowledge that there are such things. So in the end, it's the scientific methodology that is, as we're defining the natural or the physical, rather than any special view as to what the correct physical theory is going to say. And I mean, you get a kind of spectrum of naturalist views, with the hardline naturalists typically giving the privilege just to fundamental physics, and with softer naturalists allowing that chemistry and biology and other forms of science are going to count as well. I think that even when you've cashed out the natural in such methodological terms, there is actually still quite a significant agenda that's built into the well, it hardly needs saying into such a view, and I think one way of indicating how such a view might be problematic, even from quite a scientific point of view, is to point out that if the claim is that, as it were, everything is part of the natural world in the sense that everything that there is can be discovered by the scientific method, and we will say more about what that might consist in later. I mean, one obvious implication of that is that everything that there is capable of being known, because the claim is it's capable of being known by the scientific method. And I mean, that itself is a very strong claim, and particularly a strong claim if the idea is that it's capable of being known by human beings, who presumably are envisaged as the ones who are applying the scientific method. And it's not even a claim which is or seems obviously true from a scientific point of view, in the sense that, from a scientific point of view, the human scientific community that's an activity of a certain species on a certain planet, and the claim that everything that there is capable of being discovered by this methodology pursued by a particular species on a particular planet. It doesn't seem to have any very obvious plausibility to it. I mean, from a scientific point of view, why on earth shouldn't there be things which are just incapable of being discovered, perhaps by any means whatsoever, and in particular by those kind of humanly available means? And I mean, in saying that, there's no, as it were, religious or quasi-religious agenda involved. It's simply a matter of, as it were, whether the nature of the universe is such as to lend itself entirely to investigation and discovery by the kind of complex creatures within such a universe that are capable of applying a certain type of methodology. And it seems like an entirely open question whether that would be the case. Of course, you might wonder, well, but if there are exceptions to that, things that can't be discovered by scientific means, how are we supposed to know that? But we don't have to know that there are such exceptions for it to be a very risky kind of claim that there are no such exceptions, that everything can be discovered by those kinds of means. And actually, there's a further kind of logical point, which is it could, in principle, be that that we might be able to know in some way that there are exceptions without, as it were, being able to know what the exceptions themselves were. I mean, it might be that some scientific model of the universe might itself have the consequence that there are parts of the universe which are not capable of supporting the kind of intelligent life that would be required to find out about them, or something like that. I mean, that could simply be a corollary of an otherwise well-established scientific theory. So that kind of metaphysical claim about the nature of reality, even when the naturalness notion is cashed out in methodological terms, does not have any very obvious scientific standing. So now I'll switch just to a more purely methodological version of naturalism, which is roughly the idea that the best or only way of investigating reality is by using a scientific method. And this is, if you notice, this is a somewhat more cautious claim in the sense that it isn't claiming now that all aspects of the world are capable of being discovered. It leaves it open that there are some that are not. It's just saying, roughly speaking, that whatever we can know about the world, we can know by scientific means, something like that. So in a certain way, it's a more modest claim. But let's just press it a bit to see what it really involves. Now, when self-identified naturalists talk about the scientific method, what they generally have in mind is something like the hypothetico-deductive method. And so what I mean by that is a form of scientific theorizing in which scientists formulate hypotheses, theories, and deduce consequences from them for observable matters which they can then test by experiment and so on. So roughly speaking, it's the methodology of the natural sciences. Now, there are various sort of questions to ask about that. I mean, one is whether that's really the methodology of everything that should be called a science. And probably the most obvious challenge to it comes from the case of mathematics. So in the case of mathematics, does not primarily proceed by doing experiments. I mean, it proceeds by proving theorems. Of course, there are interesting questions about where the first principles of mathematics come from, but they don't really come from doing experiments in the sense in which naturalists have in mind, which is a sense that's closely modeled on experiments as done in the natural sciences. And so, just from, I mean, the case of mathematics already raises a serious challenge to this kind of naturalism, because if the claim is that the best way of investigating questions is by the scientific method, understood in the specific sense of the method of the natural sciences, then we've got to ask, well, is mathematics itself a science? I think one of the sort of pressure points with naturalism actually has to do with that question, because if naturalists say no, mathematics doesn't count as a science, what it's doing is not scientific method, then their claim for the superior status of scientific method looks, for as it were relatively unproblematic reasons, are very shaky, because I mean, mathematics looks like one of the greatest success stories in the human pursuit of knowledge that has produced enormous amounts of knowledge of a, we don't have to claim total certainty, but of a reliability that is way above what, in fact, what you find in most of the natural sciences. And so if we're being told that the scientific method is for all purposes is the best one, where that's understood as an experimental method, then mathematics looks like an obvious exception to it. I think one of the things that's often going on when people press for the superiority of the scientific method is that they're not very clear whether they mean that it's the best method for answering the type of questions that are asked in the natural sciences, or whether they mean it's simply the best method for investigating how things are in general. I mean, if the claim were just the former, that as what the method, the scientific method, in the way I described it, was the best method for answering the kind of questions that are asked in the natural sciences, then I suspect very few people would disagree with that. I mean, one probably find some, but that's I would think of that as a relatively uncontroversial claim, but it's also not a claim with very much clout, because, well, for example, in the case of philosophy, naturalists in philosophy are often criticizing philosophers for not being naturalistic enough in their methods, which typically means that they're not referring to the results of the natural sciences, and they're not doing their own experiments, and so on. But if the claim for the superiority of the scientific method was just a claim about it as a way of answering questions in the natural sciences, then there would be no basis for that criticism unless you already had somehow that philosophy counted as one of the natural sciences, which doesn't seem very, very plausible. So, I mean, the alternative, of course, would be for the naturalist to try to loosen up the description of scientific method, to give some much broader description of it, such that that mathematics would somehow could be brought under that description as well. I mean, I guess within philosophy, the person who's done most to develop such a conception would probably be the American philosopher Quine, whose picture was a kind of holistic one, on which what we're doing is adjusting our total theory of everything to experience, where mathematics is simply part of that picture. And so Quine's view was that mathematics does get, in some sense, confirmed or verified in the same way as everything else by experience, but indirectly, because mathematics is constantly being applied in the natural sciences. I think the general view these days is that that's not really an adequate description of the methodology of mathematics, because mathematics, in fact, like most disciplines, has a lot more autonomy than you would think from such a description. And even when mathematicians are interested in not simply in proving more and more theorems from the first principles that they've already got, but finding new axioms of mathematics, which is, I mean, that's quite a live business in the foundations of mathematics, because I mean, we know from the results of Gödel that there are, and others, that there are various questions which in mathematics which are not answerable on the basis of current axioms. I mean, they can neither be, I mean, there are hypotheses that can neither be proved nor refuted on the basis of the current axioms of mathematics. And so what mathematicians are looking for are new axioms that will enable us to settle whether these conjectures are true or false. But when they do that, they are not looking for whether these the new axioms somehow fit what's going on in physics well, because that's actually simply useless as a way of deciding on whether to accept new axioms, because it turns out that the bits of mathematics that you need for almost all applications in the natural sciences are, as it were, relatively weak subsystems of the whole of contemporary mathematics, and the sorts of questions that it's difficult to decide on the basis of contemporary, or impossible to decide on the basis of contemporary mathematics. They involve higher orders of infinity which just don't have any obvious physical applications, and so the assessment of the new axioms has to be done more on the basis of their mathematical consequences rather than any kind of interaction that they have with physics. So, you know, I don't think there's much prospect really for giving at all a specific kind of account of the method of the natural sciences where it just turns out to be the same as the method that's used in mathematics. So this kind of naturalism, which gives the priority to the method of the natural sciences, has great difficulty in explaining what the status of mathematics is. And, you know, I think another kind of difficulty that we can press on it is what the status of naturalism as a theory is by its own standards, right? Because the naturalist is claiming, I mean, to put it very crudely, that whatever can be known by the scientific method. And so if they're claiming to know the truth of naturalism itself, then it should follow that naturalism it can be established by the scientific method, but as we're just applying the doctrine to itself. But if we have a relatively specific conception of the scientific method as one which involves doing experiments and so on, then presumably we should be testing the truth of naturalism by doing experiments to test whether naturalism is true. But it's very hard to see what those experiments could be. I mean, of course, you could say, well, in doing ordinary scientific experimentation, that's a kind of test of naturalism, because if these experiments turned out badly enough for long enough, that would itself discredit the cognitive claims of the experimental method. But the kind of confirmation that we get of naturalism in that way is really very weak, because it really doesn't do anything to show that that naturalism, the scientific method is somehow better for all purposes than other methods. In particular, for example, it doesn't do anything to show that there's something wrong with the method of the standardly used in mathematics. So, I think again that there's a lot of pressure on the naturalist to drastically water down what they mean by scientific method in such a way that the kind of very informal argumentation that probably naturalists have in mind as supporting naturalism could somehow count as an application of scientific method. But because it won't look anything like a controlled experiment. And so, I think, again and again, what one finds with the characterization of naturalism is that you can interpret it as a really hardline doctrine, about the superiority of the experimental method, and understood in a fairly specific way. And it seems that something along those lines is what is actually needed for the kind of prescriptive invocations of naturalism that you tend to find when it's invoked in philosophy, for example, because what you find is let's say a certain bit of theorizing in metaphysics gets condemned as insufficiently naturalist because it doesn't invoke any results of recent scientific theorizing or something like that. But it may still be a piece of reasoning which involves the production of some kind of evidence and consideration about which hypotheses can explain it best, and so on. So that once you water down what you mean by the scientific method, you no longer are in a position to use naturalism as a stick to beat various philosophers who just are not positively invoking scientific theories, because, as it were, the kind of conception of what the scientific method might involve is just so loose that it won't exclude very much. So, as it were, for their prescriptive purposes, they need something very specific as their model of scientific method. It's just that when you then press them both on what they say about mathematics and what they say about the status of naturalism and so on, it's very difficult for them to give a remotely plausible answer. And then, as it were, the other horn of the dilemma is once they become much looser about what they understand by a scientific method, then it's much harder for them to use naturalism as a way of ruling out the kind of things that they often want to rule out. And so that's what I meant at the beginning by saying that I thought that the unclarity of the term naturalism is damaging because it allows people, when they're in aggressive mode, to rule out all sorts of activities that are going on in philosophy because they insufficiently resemble the work of natural scientists. But then, as it were, when they're in more defensive mode, they water down naturalism to a point where it's actually not claiming anything very much. And as it was, and so you get this kind of oscillation between strong, interesting, but fairly indefensible claims on the one side, and weak, boring, but fairly easily defensible claims on the other. And as where as long as you make it sufficiently unclear that this kind of oscillation is going on, it looks like quite a powerful position. Well, so I thought I would just say a few things about what we might get that's more positive from naturalism, because of course, as I mentioned, some people classify me as a naturalist, and so as it were, it can't be that there's nothing there that I'm sympathetic to. I mean, I think one thing that is, as it were, on the side of what I've been calling watered down views of scientific method, but it's still, in a way, not at all trivial, are certain kinds of intellectual values, values like curiosity, honesty, accuracy, precision, rigor, explanatory depth, and those kind of things, which I think we might endorse for all kinds of serious inquiry. But of course, those are in no way exclusive to the natural sciences or to the natural sciences and mathematics. I mean, those are values that you can find it, for example, in historical scholarship or all sorts of forms of investigation in the humanities and the social sciences as well. But I mean, I think, of course, in the abstract, they sound pretty anodyne, and it's sort of difficult but not impossible to be explicitly against them. But I think what really matters about values like that is not, or virtues like that, is not being in favor of them, but having them, or having them to some degree, because I mean, really, there is no theory that can substitute for qualities like that, because any theory can be held in a dogmatic, incurious, woolly-minded way, and so as we're I mean, there's no form of naturalism as a theory that is what's needed there. What's needed is simply those qualities in investigation themselves, and having those qualities is by no means an easy or let alone a trivial matter. So in that sense, it seems to me that that as well, the scientific spirit is an important feature of good investigation. In a way that doesn't have any sort of scientific implications, but and doesn't automatically privilege the natural sciences. I mean, it may well be that the very different forms of investigation are the appropriate ones for realizing those kinds of intellectual qualities when you're asking, for example, historical questions rather than questions of the natural sciences. So I think one thing that also tends to make people classify me as a naturalist in philosophy is something specifically about my views on philosophical method, which are really just a form of what I would call anti-exceptionalism. I mean, there are a lot of philosophers who like to think of philosophy as radically different from any other kind of investigation in the type of questions that it asks and the type of understanding that it seeks. And typically they'll say that philosophers are concerned with conceptual questions rather than factual questions or something like that. I do think that is fundamentally rubbish. That philosophical questions are not that different from the questions that are asked by all sorts of other subjects. I mean, of course, different disciplines, they differ from each other in the types of questions that they ask at a certain level of detail. But I don't think that there's the kind of massive difference in kind that some philosophers have thought between philosophical and non-philosophical questions. And I also don't think that there's a massive difference in kind between the sorts of appropriate methods for answering them. I mean, of course, any two disciplines that you take will differ to some extent in the methods that they use, and that applies to philosophy just like any other discipline. But I think, as it were, it's that kind of difference that we're talking about, not something that, as it were, has every other discipline over here and philosophy over there, or something like that. The other aspect of naturalism that I'm sympathetic to, although it's not altogether easy to be precise about it, is that at the very least, what we're doing in philosophy should be consistent with the well-established results of well, I would say any other respectable discipline, but in particular, I mean, that's, I mean, for the purposes of metaphysics, for example, I mean, physics is the most obvious discipline to look at, and so I certainly regard it as a very bad sign if a philosophical theory is saying things which are inconsistent with a well-established theory in physics or, as I say, any other well-established discipline. Saying that doesn't, in fact, get you very much, because logical inconsistency is not easy to come by, and the difficulty is that the logical consequences of physical theory are generally ones stated in the terms of the physical theory itself. And I think, as it were, just going back slightly to beating the hardline naturalists again for a moment, I mean, a problem with the way that that one often finds naturalists arguing is that they go from saying that that physics doesn't mention entities of some kind, for example, it doesn't mention debt crises or society or whatever, to saying that physics implies that there are no such entities. And I mean, that's just a logical fallacy, because, I mean, from the fact that a theory doesn't entail that there is something of a certain kind, let's say a debt crisis, it just doesn't follow that it entails that there is nothing of that kind. I mean, it's simply, from a logical point of view, it's simply something that is left open. So, you know, although I think it's a perfectly reasonable constraint that philosophical theories should be consistent with well-established theories in the natural and sciences and elsewhere, I don't think you can get very much out of it, because logical inconsistency is quite hard to come by. What we want is something that's tells us a bit more than that, that doesn't require something as strong as logical inconsistency. For example, if philosophical theories imply things that are extremely improbable given well-established scientific theories, that seems like a strong strike against them. But the difficulty is to cash out that notion of being improbable given a well-established theory, because the probabilities involved are themselves probably not going to be the ones that might be talked about within the physical theory itself. I mean, for example, you know, there are probabilistic theories in quantum mechanics and so on, but they by themselves won't give you anything of a less formal kind, to the effect that such and such a metaphysical hypothesis is extremely improbable given the theory. And you know, I think there are a lot of cases where we have a sense that the scientific theory makes certain philosophical views improbable, but where it's very difficult to explain exactly what's going on. So an example is with theories of time. There's a certain kind of tension between the special theory of relativity and certain theories of time which in some way privilege the present. And it's one that it's difficult to crystallize in a logical incompatibility, but it may take the form, for example, that the special relativity saying that simultaneity is always relative to a frame of reference, and I mean, this, by the way, this is controversial even from a physical point of view, but if the situation is that you've got a whole lot of different frames of reference which from the physical point of view are all equally good, and then the philosopher is saying, but one of those is a privileged frame of reference. Its privilege doesn't show up in any way whatsoever in the physical theory, but nevertheless it's the right one. That's a case where it feels as though there's a kind of tension between the physics, if that's the way the physics works out, and the metaphysics, but one which falls short of a logical incompatibility. And you know, I think something that we really don't understand very, very well, but we need to understand better, is under what circumstances we can say that a certain metaphysical theory is really very, very improbable given the scientific facts as as far as they've been established, even though it's not strictly logically incompatible with them, but it's just that it's kind of difficult to take such a, and rightly difficult to take such a view seriously given such and such a physical theory. So, I think there's an enormous amount of work that still needs to be done in understanding just what the relations are of this not quite logical kind, but still some sort of evidential kind between philosophical theories on the one hand and theories in the natural sciences on the other. So I'm not the kind of extreme anti-naturalist who thinks that philosophy fundamentally has got nothing to learn from the natural sciences. I think we do have a lot to learn from them, but it's also very easy to get, as we're over enthusiastic about what the natural sciences are telling us. And I think a characteristic fault of the self-identified naturalists is that they simply grossly overestimate the consequences in other terms of scientific theories. Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Williamson, for that extremely interesting talk. We have some time now for questions. Just before we begin, I'd like to say, for those who haven't been at this seminar before, that Mikołaj Sowkowski-Roda will be handing around this microphone, and if you would allow the microphone to come to you before you ask your question, so it can be captured on our cameras. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and if no one does immediately, you're too late, Sam. I'll start with one of my own. So I just wanted to ask about the case of mathematics as a counterexample to the thesis that the scientific method, whatever that is, something about experimentation, is the only way we have of finding out about the world. Now, obviously, I suppose the classic response to that would be the Humean line that mathematics is somehow just about relations amongst ideas, or it's not really giving us knowledge about the world, but some kind of something inferior, or something that is merely a matter of convention. So how would you like to respond to that kind of challenge, or how would you be inclined to respond to that?
Well, I think various attempts were made, especially in the earlier 20th century, to work out a philosophy of mathematics along those lines, and none of them have been successful. I mean, I won't go into a lot of detail, but one sort of approach, for example, would be to say that that as well, mathematics has no material content of its own. It's just about what the consequences of as we're playing a game by certain rules are. And one version of this would be the sort of formalism that David Hilbert advocated. And the classic rebuttal of that comes from Gödel's second incompleteness theorem. So what was the issue there was that there are facts about, even if we're just talking about it as it were a game, with moving things around on a board or whatever, there are all sorts of facts about such a game. For example, whether it's possible to reach a certain configuration on the board and so on. And in the case of mathematics, if you think of it as just as a formal system, the outstanding question, this came up in quite a precise form in Hilbert's program, but it's I mean, sort of import is clear, is whether the formal system is consistent or not. And I mean, if you're thinking about the case of arithmetic, that would you could think, are we able to prove naught equals 1, which just means, as it were, if you think of it in formalistic terms, it would be, can we, by moving pieces about on the board, can we eventually get naught equals 1? Or, and it turns out that establishing the consistency of arithmetic is something that you can only do in a more powerful mathematical theory. So, as it were, the idea that somehow, once we just treat it as a formal system, we're kind of moving out of mathematics. It doesn't really work, because the questions about the formal system itself are mathematical questions, and I mean, the question of whether an inconsistency can be derived in arithmetic. I mean, that's a question which, on pretty much any view has a certain factual content, because it's asking about whether you could have a certain physically describable sequence of marks obeying the rules for a proof, which have circle, two horizontal parallel lines, but vertical line as the last line. So I think that all our experience in the past century of philosophy of mathematics has been that views which try to treat mathematical knowledge as not concerned with substantive questions just don't work.
Thank you. So we had Sam, then Andrew, and then we'll continue towards the back.
Thank you very much, Professor Williamson. I'm obviously very sympathetic to much of what you were saying. Well, to all of what you were saying, but I wanted to ask, so do you take this view of philosophical methodology to be congenial to the use of intuitions in philosophy?
Well, I think the prior question is just what the category of intuition is supposed to cover. Of course, there's been a lot of controversy about the use of intuitions in philosophy, but it seems to me that a lot of the debate has been undermined by the fact that people are just uncritically using this category of intuition. And just to say something to, as we're problematize it, the way this debate has arisen in philosophy has generally had to do with the use of thought experiments, which of course is something that's as old as Plato in philosophy, but it's become a much more systematic kind of methodology where people are constantly testing hypotheses by coming up with hypothetical scenarios, which are then to see whether they constitute counterexamples to the hypotheses, because the hypotheses themselves are understood as saying that something is necessary, and so if you can find a possible scenario in which it fails, that's enough to refute the hypothesis. And so when the paradigm that people generally have in mind of an intuition is a verdict on a thought experiment. So a classic one, which actually goes back to Bertrand Russell in philosophy, is consider somebody who judges that it's 3 o'clock, and they're looking at a clock that says 3 o'clock, and indeed it is 3 o'clock, but unbeknownst to them, this clock has stopped, and it's just a coincidence that it's showing the right time. Then the normal judgment about that is that this guy does not know that it's 3 o'clock, even though he has a maybe justified true belief in some sense that it's 3 o'clock. And so that's an example of an intuition. Now, it seems, when we think of these thought experiments, it seems that we're dealing with a very distinctive category. But one way you can see that isn't really the case is that these thought experiments generally, at least when they're not too science fictional, they have real life counterparts. So we can easily set up we can observe somebody looking at a clock at that has stopped at 3 o'clock at 3 o'clock. And in fact, I didn't do it today, but in some of my lectures, I've set up real life Gettier cases, and as it were, have put people in the audience in the very situation being described. Now, supposing we had actually done that, and we got somebody here, that we could observe judging that it was 3 o'clock from the basis of the stop clock, then we could use the real life example just as well, and then the relevant judgment would be he doesn't know that it's 3 o'clock, but and then most of the people who've been critical of this kind of method have not wanted to say, well, as long as we observe a person really looking at a clock, then everything's fine, because it's kind of obvious that that's not where the action is in these cases. And so they're forced to say that it's an intuition when we just judge that he doesn't know that it's 3 o'clock. But that's simply a judgment that we're making on the basis of observation, because we've seen him looking at the stop clock and so on. That somebody doesn't have this property of knowing that it's 3 o'clock. And of course, you could say, well, any judgment that we make using the word no counts as an intuition. But I think that would be much too drastic, because the kind of critics and use that term themselves all the time, and it seems just in ordinary scientific inquiry we have to be making judgments about whether we know that the experiment has been done correctly or whatever it is, and so it seems to me that when you generalize the type of judgments that are at issue in this methodological debate, they cover so many judgments that there is there's no chance of being skeptical about them all without just being a wholesale skeptic. Of course, it could be that specific judgments that we make about some specific thought experiments are mistaken. I've got no inclination to say that we're infallible about thought experiments. Any more than we're infallible about anything else. But it's very hard to find any kind of useful distinctive category of intuition that's at stake in this debate.
Do people sometimes say non-inferential knowledge?
Well, but you see, the thing is, in the case of the person that we're judging not to know that it's 3 o'clock, it seems that it is inferential, because we're using. Of course, we haven't gone through an explicit deduction in our heads, but we're using information such as the information that the clock has stopped and so on, as those are feeding into our judgment that he doesn't know that it's 3 o'clock. So that it's in the real life case, it's inferential. And although of course we're not doing exactly that in the thought experiment case, in my view, it's actually doubly inferential, because what's going on is that we are imagining a scenario with such and such features, and then we're making an inferential judgment, as well, within this imaginative exercise that he doesn't know, and then we do a further inference by something that corresponds to the sort of logical move of conditional proof that then if somebody were in that situation, they wouldn't know. And so, that actually the judgments that we're making are, in a broad sense, they're inferential. I mean, they're not, of course, they're not judgments that we typically make on the basis of some kind of very controlled inference in the way that maybe we do when we're doing a mathematical deduction. But that isn't a very interesting feature of them. And in fact, because if you think about the ones, I mean, there's no point in trying to privilege the judgments that we make on the basis of a consciously controlled inference, because when you look at their premises, you'll end up with some premises that are not there on the basis of a consciously controlled inference. So it's very hard for the skeptics to, as it were, to give any general category to be skeptical about that doesn't commit them to the wholesale skepticism that they themselves definitely don't want to be stuck with.
Andrew.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, sketching out the landscape of naturalism. I've been a physicist, and I love physics. It's very good at the quantitative study of two-body systems. But of course, there's a lot more to reality than that. And I can see certain dangers of naturalism applied too broadly. So the comment has sometimes been made that psychologists have not got the insights of Shakespeare or Jane Austen for all their application of scientific method to human nature. But then again, maybe Shakespeare is also just atoms in motion. So do you think there are actual dangers of over-application of naturalism to ourselves objectively in terms of what we know and to ourselves in terms of what we are? And how will we protect ourselves from these dangers? Thank you.
Well, I certainly think that people who self-identify as naturalists very often go in for highly reductive, scientistic ways of thinking that don't really have much scientific basis. I mean, the case of psychology is it's quite a rich case, because I mean, I completely agree that Shakespeare and Jane Austen had all sorts of insights into what human beings are like that go way beyond anything that one can find in contemporary scientific psychology. But I don't think that one should conclude from that scientific psychology is just barking up the wrong tree or something like that. It seems to me that it's often a very valuable exercise, and kind of long-term systematic exercise to impose certain restrictions on the ways of knowing that we're going to allow in a certain discipline, and then to try to build up on the basis of as a relatively restricted methodology. And an example of that actually is mathematics, where I mean there are famous examples of cases in which mathematicians have established mathematical conclusions by methods that remove any serious doubt, but which do not constitute proofs. I mean, there's a famous example with Euler and working out by he was concerned with the sum of a certain series, and he worked it out by what it should be by just by analogy. But then he also summoned the first few members of the series to check that they were in fact very close to his prediction, and it was, you know, and I can't remember what it was, but it was, you know, pi squared over 4 or whatever, and there wasn't much doubt, but he didn't think that that constituted a proof, and nobody else did either. And, you know, I think it's been extremely fruitful for mathematics, as it were, to restrict itself to proof from a very well recognized narrow set of proof methods or first principles, and as it were, just to build everything up from there. And although of course actually the methods of proof in his time were not, they were not surefire, but they were better than that. And so, you know, I think in the long run, it's entirely appropriate that psychology should be done in this experimental way, and theories be built up and tested by those methods, and to see where we get. And that's fine, as you know. I mean, we don't. I mean, you know, I think we can combine that with realizing that there are other forms of knowing about how human beings work that, in certain circumstances, may be very reliable, but which can't, as it were, easily be simulated by these experimental methods. But you know, in the long run, I think we are understanding something more about human beings, and by the scientific methods. I mean, whether they will ever, as it were, be capable of recovering the kind of, you know, these less formal insights is another matter. And you know, it's, you know, I mean, often you get these kind of disconnects in the same way that I mean, there are all sorts of things that we know about the physical world through macroscopic experience that we have no idea how to derive from fundamental physics, and you know, so that, you know, I think it's important just not to go overboard and think that anything that we don't know by these methods just doesn't count as knowledge. But at the same time, recognize the importance of a form of systematic inquiry where we're very strict about what methods we're going to allow ourselves.
Next was just at the back there.
I have hopefully a slightly simpler question. So people like Alex Rosenberg or James Ladyman have labeled something akin to what you're attacking, scientism, and they say that's what they obviously defend scientism. Ladyman has gone on to say, well, it's more of a stance rather than a, you know, it's a combination of some kind of a positive empiricism and a kind of negative materialism, since there are no ghosts. Could you help us out on just what would you see the difference between scientism, as they define it, and naturalism? And do you think this idea of it being a stance rather than, you know, a kind of full-blown theory is helpful?
Well, what they mean by naturalism, but what they mean by scientism, I think corresponds to the harder line versions of naturalism that I've been talking about, and I think they would be perfectly happy with that characterization of it. I mean, I think it's you know, the characterization of it as a stance, I think, is quite close to as a methodological characterization of naturalism, in the sense that you know, it just has to do with what kind of methods one's going to be impressed by as ways of answering questions. I mean, I don't think that calling it a stance in any way renders it anodyne or harmless. I mean, you know, in the case of Ladyman, I think that I regard his attitude as pernicious in the sense that it goes with a dismissal of forms of argument in metaphysics that are not closely related to what goes on in physics, that it seems to me has no, in a broader sense, no scientific basis. In the case of Rosenberg, whom I actually had an exchange with in the Stone, the New York Times philosophy blog, he goes in for what I think of as a bizarrely extreme form of naturalism, because he really wants to say that there just isn't anything that deserves the term knowledge outside the hard sciences. And in this debate, I was saying to him what I would regard as just a platitude, that if you want to know what happened at the Battle of Gettysburg, you should ask a historian, not a physicist. And but his attitude was not, well, of course, and I'm not denying that, but well, actually, there isn't really any such thing as historical knowledge, so who cares? I would think of that as pretty much a reductio ad absurdum of the view.
So I think this gentleman here was next.
Thank you very much.
So if you just wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much. I'd like to perhaps pick up a bit where Andrew was with his question. And I may have missed a move because I was so excited by what you said, and I was thinking about it, that I missed the opposite pole of the dialectic. So it may be that I'm wrong. But as I understood you, you were saying that naturalism can be characterized as the consistency of philosophical theories with well-established results in physics or any other well-established discipline.
I was saying that was one naturalist claim that I'm quite happy with.
Okay.
But I don't think that it captures that much of what in practice naturalists have wanted to insist on.
Can I try and press just that very soft naturalism then on what we understand as a well-established discipline? We know, to cut to the chase, that this university was founded by Christian monks, and that they were at the leading edge of a very well-established discipline that had been in existence for 1,000 years. So I'm just interested in what kind of non-question begging criterion of well-established discipline one could offer, which is not going to exclude arbitrarily and a priori theology as a discipline with which philosophical theories ought to be consistent.
Yeah, so I don't think that it's that there is, as it were, any kind of algorithm for what counts as a discipline in good standing. Of course, if we just meant by well established that it was institutionally well established, there's absolutely no question about theology, but
of course, I meant something much.
Yes, and so did I. Well, and of course, we do have to, and we're taking theology here not, for example, as claims about what Aquinas thought or whatever, which are relatively, do require kind of certain kind of theological, but as it were, claims about the existence of God and so on.
I wouldn't particularly say that was an interesting theological claim. I mean, let's take, for example, the view universally held by Christians for 2,000 years that Jesus is fully divine and fully
Yes.
human.
Yeah. Well, I would. I mean, as speaking as an atheist, I'd be inclined to say that that sort of view is a commitment to a view like that is too much built into the foundations of theology for it to count as one which is being properly tested in the discipline. So, you know, I'm not going to be that concessive about what goes on in theology. I think it may well be that as it were, all sorts of conditional claims are established in theology of the form that such and such a theory has such and such consequences. But of course, what you're interested in is whether the theory is true, not whether it has these.
Theologians on the whole probably don't talk about theories. We would talk about doctrines.
Well,
because we don't regard ourselves as constructing theories.
And what's supposed to be at issue in describing it as a doctrine and not a theory?
Well, on my view, a theory is a tentative, hypothetical explanation which, if true, yields greater understanding of reality than if false. A doctrine is a stretch of teaching which explicates that which has happened. And this is why Christian theologians will typically not find arguments about the existence of God terribly interesting in systematic theology, because what they want to do is to work out the implications of the confession of faith that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. And it's that kind of statement which then motivates the stretch of teaching which comes out as the Chalcedonian definition, or the homoousion, that the word is of one substance with the Father. So
I was just going to have to say we have one more question.
Yes. Okay. Well, yes. So just on that, I mean, I think the description that, from an outsider's point of view, the description that you've just given explains why one shouldn't take theology as putting its conclusions on a firm footing.
So we have one more question. The gentleman in blue up here. No, up here. Okay. Sorry, there's only enough time for one more.
Cheers. So thanks again for your talk. I was just wondering, so what do you make of the naturalist's simple rejection of some of the questions that traditionally philosophers have found interesting? So Quine quite famously said, look, like, we can't find a solution to Hume's problem, so let's just forget about it. Do you think that kind of move is legitimate for the naturalist to make?
Not really, because I don't think that the naturalist actually abjures all questions of how we ought to proceed in inquiry. I mean, they obviously have strong views which are central to their position about how we ought to proceed, and so given that they're committed to taking seriously questions about how inquiry ought to proceed, I think it's they can't just dismiss the question of whether it's permissible for us to rely on induction. I mean, I don't. That doesn't mean that they have to have a some kind of justification of induction on, you know, on from something more basic or whatever. I mean, you know, I think that it would be okay for them to have some kind of story about why it's legitimate to take induction as, you know, a first principle or something like that. But you know, I think that the refusal to engage with the question, I think is not really legitimate on their own terms. And of course, sometimes what you get is you know, a latter-day version of logical positivism in which they're dismissing certain questions as meaningless, and I think typically when they dismiss questions as meaningless, they're doing so on the basis of a theory of meaning that just doesn't stand up to scrutiny in the philosophy of language.
Okay, well, we have run out of our allotted time for questions. There is, of course, a drinks reception after the seminar at which we'll all have further opportunity to discuss the issues raised. Before we do that, I'd ask you once again to thank our speaker this evening, Timothy Williamson, for his talk.